Depends which environment you would enter into. Probably. But you're right. They all have their dress code. Well, this is Richard Palmer, and he's here to share with us. And I'm going to let him introduce himself and tell us a little bit about where he's been. And here's your handout that you were using. Well, not a handout. Guidance. Notes. Richard's been graduated here in 2011. We're just getting the degree you guys are getting. So I thought he wanted to come and visit on campus, and I thought that what an excellent opportunity for us to listen to him, what he has to share with us about. I told him one of the things I wanted him to talk about was things I wish I knew before I went to graduate school. Yeah. So that might be important. And then as you're listening to him, try to think of maybe jot down some questions that you might have for him as he's talking about what he's doing. And even if you're not going to graduate school, if you were going, or even to get out and looking for a job, those kind of things.
Yeah, I just read that recently, so I have a lot to tell them that. But has anyone applied for one, or one person? What are you applying for? Do you know?
Marriage and family.
Marriage and family. Has anyone else kind of thought about it, kicked the idea around, or kind of so maybe?
Huh. Yeah. Madison, you're going to go to graduate school.
Yeah. I mean, I can understand, because I didn't really start thinking about it until late in my senior year, and I kind of did it as a stalling method, because I didn't really feel like I was ready to get in the workforce yet. So I thought if I went for a couple more years, I could get more experience, kind of get a higher education, and if nothing else, I figured it'd maybe help kick me up a little bit higher on the pay scale. But anyways, yeah, I've been going to Emporia State University. It took me 3 years, which is a little longer than I was hoping, but...
what was the degree in?
Clinical psychology, which is the most technical sounding one besides neuro, basically. But it's really not as complicated as it might sound. But anyways, I guess one of the main things that I'm just going to kind of check because I'm not sure, but from what I remember, a full semester of hours is 15 to 18, and that's kind of what you're going through. But in grad school, it's more like 12 to 14, and it doesn't seem like a huge difference, maybe just from the numbers, but they definitely schedule things a lot differently. So, for example, as far as whenever I was an undergrad, you went to classes basically every weekday, guaranteed, unless you really got lucky and kind of worked your schedule out, so you had maybe no classes Monday or Thursday or something. But in grad school, they're pretty much going to condense it down. You only meet for that class once a week for a 3-hour period, and then you maybe only have classes 2 days out of the whole week. And so that's a completely different scenario. And so that clears up a whole lot more free time. And so at first, because I remember when I was an undergrad, I hated 3-hour classes. Those were horrible, they were boring, they took way too long. You were just kind of sitting through the whole thing. But when I got to grad school, and that's what all your classes were like, I actually got to like it. Because then you were done with it. You walked out, and you didn't have to worry about it for another week. And I guess the other thing about that is that the professors don't necessarily feel that need to keep you for a full 3 hours. They kind of just go until it's like, you know what, we've covered all the material, that's good enough, and I maybe get out a half hour or hour early. That wasn't necessarily every time, but that was kind of a nice thing. And that's just something to keep in mind is, with all that free time, you can certainly look into a part-time job. Because I know when I was an undergrad, with that 5 days a week thing and all these goofy schedules, like you have chapel Wednesdays, Fridays at 10 o'clock, and then probably some afternoon classes, you may have an evening class Thursday. I mean, you can't really work a job in there too easily. But if you meet for 2 or 3 days a week, that definitely leaves a lot more time and a lot more flexibility to get into another job. And I actually didn't do that because I had problems finding work that I wanted to do, but it's definitely more possible.
What's
was gonna say, is everyone still living in a dorm right now, or if you, no? Where you guys live right now?
I live in a house.
One of the campus houses, or?
No, my
Oh, okay, you've already moved out. I see. You too?
Same.
Same.
Different house though.
Okay.
I live with my grandparents.
Oh, okay. You're one of the lucky people who have local family.
I live in North Valley School.
School. What about you?
Darn, I used to live off campus, but I just moved back on the house.
Yeah, I was mainly a dorm person myself, and then my last year I was able to get into one of the guest houses, or whatever they call them, schoolhouse, whatever.
Across the street house.
Yeah, pretty much.
Specific names for the houses.
Yeah, I don't remember that. I remember my dorm name, but I don't remember my house name. Go figure. But yeah, I guess that's really handy because when you do get into grad school, the nice thing is you'll be moving out, depending on where you go, but you won't be living in a dorm unless you really, really want to, which I don't think anybody here is that desperate for it. But I guess the nice thing about that is that, you get all the convenience of being kind of out on your own. And I guess for those who live in their own house off campus, you're kind of used to paying your bills and dealing with all that kind of issues. But for those who are on the guest house, like I was, that's going to be that next step you're going to have to get used to and prepare for, is finding the leaves and security deposits and all that kind of nonsense. But
Budgets and
yeah.
budgeting for that, yeah.
Because you got to have, theoretically, on top of your first month rent, you got to have maybe an additional month rent for a deposit or something. And the other issue is the lease, because those can really screw you over.
Yeah.
So you want to make sure that you're 100% about what you're doing before you kind of make a commitment like that. But what I'm going to say with that, though, is if you're going to be living, let's say, I'm just going to toss out like Tulsa. If you go to graduate school in Tulsa and you have an apartment there and you are from like 2 hours away from your family and you want to go back for summer break, it actually might be really intelligent to go ahead and take summer classes, because you're already paying for the rent for the apartment anyways. And that was something, I never took summer classes in undergrad. There was really no need, and it wouldn't have really helped any. But in grad school, because you have to take, my program was 60 hours, and that was about 15 hours per semester on average. But I was only taking about 12 to 14 because I took summer courses, and that really helped take it down a notch. And it was just really handy, since I was already paying for the apartment's rent for the summer anyways. It's like, why not go ahead and take advantage of it? Because I would rather stay in the apartment I'm paying for, go ahead and take classes, instead of go back home for the 3 months and pay rent for an empty room and not use them. That was something I did. And of course, another issue with that is finding a good roommate that can really help with finances. And I got really lucky, honestly, because I went to undergrad in Oklahoma, but I'm from Kansas. And so when I went back to grad school, I was going to Emporia State University, which is pretty far from my hometown, but I ended up getting a roommate from high school I knew. So that worked out just perfectly. I knew him, we were pretty similar, we were both responsible, and it was really easy and made things a lot better. But I'm sure that if you're not quite that lucky, it can be really nerve-wracking trying to find someone to kind of room with you and help split that cost. Because that can make a real difference when you're paying for classes, you're paying all these bills, and it'd be really nice if you could offset that off by having somebody else living with you. I mean, for those who live in the house, I'm guessing that's what you do right now, right? Or?
Yeah, I have 3 other roommates.
And they all from campus, I'm sure? Or?
Yeah.
So that made it pretty simple and natural. That were they all friends, or?
We're on the soccer team.
Yeah, okay. So you had that connection, and that just kind of made it really kind of
Easier.
follow the process, kind of happen naturally. How about, was that kind of the same
Yeah, I have 4 roommates, and 3 of us are on the basketball team.
Mhm.
One is just a good friend on campus, and then one graduated, I think, last year.
Yeah. So is that something, I'm not sure if you're gonna drive, you said you were, but is that something you're kind of thinking about, or?
Getting a roommate?
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Cheaper.
Right, how are you gonna go about it though? Have you?
Well, one of my roommates, she's actually from the same area, and
Mhm.
we applied to the same grad school, so hopefully we'll both get it.
Okay. So you kind of being lucky like I did, having someone you know going to the same school, and just gonna kind of click for you. And anyone you said you kind of thought about, and Dr. or Professor View kind of threw you on the spot and said you were going to grad school?
Yeah, I'm going to grad school. I'm just kind of going back and forth on what I want to do. It changes very often.
What do you mean by changes? Wait.
Well, like I'm considering becoming a PA.
Mhm.
I'm also considering like either industrial organizational psychology or grad school.
Oh, okay. Kind of completely opposite. But probably decent money in both areas. At least IO, that's supposedly where all the money is in psychology.
Industrial, IO stands for
Industrial, what is it, organizational?
organizational, okay. Because you'd be associated with business, right? That's why you get paid more.
Mhm.
So they appreciate anything you do to increase the bottom line.
Right.
And to keep employees, retain employees that they've trained and all that.
Right. Basically a more professional and less dramatic version of like those restaurant rescue and bar rescue shows and all that kind of stuff. They call in an expert and have them fix up their business. That's basically what I'd imagine you do, is kind of that sort of thing, but more methodical, I'm sure more fun paperwork and stuff too.
Yeah, the only issue with that is that usually you have to be doing it long enough that you have a professional reputation if they're going to call you as a consultant. Whereas you might get a job if you're going to be a sports psychologist, you might get a job on a team that would be lesser than maybe the top dog psychologist. But I don't know exactly how you'd work your way into something like that, because that's out of my field.
Yeah.
But it'd be good to have somebody that has done that to come and talk about it a little bit. And you also said, you mentioned neuropsych and clinical psych. Can you tell them the difference between did they have that? Did they have both at your school?
Well, the way I'd put it is there are a lot of people who are in the clinical psych program that were interested in neuropsych. And basically what neuropsych is I know it came up in Introduction to Psychology, where you talk about the brain structure, what basically different parts of the brain are basically responsible for what they do and all that sort of thing. And neuropsych is just basically related to that issue. And it seemed like a lot of people who were interested in it were interested in the neurotesting, which, as far as I understand, I've never actually seen it or done it, but it's sort of, you just give them a bunch of different tasks, and you just kind of see whether they can perform them well or not, and that might signify some sort of brain damage, that might signify, I'm not sure about chemical imbalances, but kind of those sorts
Immaturity, brain damage. It's a specialty field for people that, a lot of times it's for when the psychologist can't figure out exactly what's going on, they'll refer them for neuropsych, but that's probably an oversimplification. They may have solid reasons why. That's what I've seen I work with attachment disorder kids, and sometimes my consultant would refer them because she thought that there was something wrong structurally, or maybe something, part of their brain wasn't functioning properly, and it gave more specifics about it. But she had her own specific reasons, and it was above me. Or a social worker. It's just like I'm just kind of, that's why I brought her in as a consultant, because you'd have these really complex issues with these kids that you have to have a really good assessment to even know what to do. And but that would be a high paid position as well.
Yeah, neuropsych, especially the testing side of disorder.
Yeah, if you're doing the testing, that's the only reason I can see why you do it, actually.
Yeah, besides the researchy kind of stuff.
Right, yeah, exactly. Dr. Amen, you could kind of consider him neuropsych, although he's a psychiatrist. It would be, he's more of an MD, but neuropsychiatrist.
Right.
But in doing the brain scans, it would be kind of like neurocycle. He's looking at the brain. And he developed his own tests then based on all those scans that he did. So you don't have to go take a scan. Maybe you can kind of at least figure out where the ideas to look for problems are based on knowledge. But there's specific psychological testing for neuropsych.
Mhm. Yeah.
And they might do an EEGs and all that stuff. And it depends on how sophisticated they want to go with the scanning and all that.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, with testing, since you mentioned that, that was one of the things that I kind of got interested in for my graduate work, because my very first semester we covered intelligence tests, and I had a really good professor, but basically what we did is we learned how to administer the intelligence test by giving it to just random people we could find, whoever we could get. And I did a total of, I think, 15. And there's basically 3 main types, one for adults, one for teenagers, and then one for really little kids. But it's funny because this is more towards my internship, but when I started my internship, I learned like maybe say 5 main kind of different tests, and I had that kind of working knowledge with them. But I ended up doing a bunch of different tests I never even heard of before. And some of the ones that come to mind are like the Beck Hopelessness, what is it, BHS scale, the BDI, Beck Depression Inventory, SBS, Suicide Probability Scale. I guess I should mention that I did an internship for a state hospital inpatient, which may not mean much to any of you right now, but if you ever go in that direction, it's basically you get people who are kind of severely in their symptoms and need some crisis stabilization and such.
And you see just about everything in there.
Yeah, I've heard people say that they've seen things there they never even seen before.
Right. Because in order to get inpatient, you have to be so severe that they've eliminated all the possibility of you being in the community at that time. It may be that you only go in for 3 or 4 days for stabilization, or 10 days, or however long it takes. Because that's the insurance. That's based on Medicaid and the limits they try to put on everything so that the state doesn't spend a whole bunch of money. They used to warehouse people.
Yeah.
So they've gone the other way now, and they limit the stay that you have. But you would see people come and go, some of them maybe more than once, depending on how long you were there.
Sometimes 30, 40.
Yeah, they might be there for a month. It might take that long.
Yeah.
Do you have to justify why they're there? If they have to stay longer, it's because they're still severe enough to be a danger to themselves or others usually,
Right.
or not able to function in the community
Mm.
with the supports that are there.
Right. And I'll just mention that all this kind of talk makes it sound like, these are incredibly, I'll just kind of use non-professional terms, but really crazy, really out there, incredibly hard to work with. And I was definitely anxious, apprehensive, and nervous when I first started. But I was there from starting in July to the end of January. And they're really, it's hard to explain it exactly, but I guess I'll just ask real quickly. When you think of people who are like severely mentally ill, what sort of words or how would you kind of describe it if you think about that? I would guess crazy's probably out there. Yeah.
Schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
Hallucinations.
Right. Kind of, I don't want to say maybe mumbling and muttering and saying just nonsense, but that just doesn't make any sense. You can't talk to them, you can't interact with them. But for the most part, that's a very small minority of people who were really that far gone. A lot of people were very cogent. You could have conversations with them. They made sense. They were lucid, basically, if I'm using the right word there. And they
We
weren't
don't
like-
know the difference, so that's okay.
Right. They weren't scary. They weren't like, it wasn't horrifying to be in the room with them, I would say. there were maybe a couple people you had to be kind of careful with. And there would be people, I know of one or two cases where they had like that parroting, where they just say what you said and the sort of unusual symptoms, but for the most part, it wasn't that bad working with them. And I guess I just kind of offer that for kind of a relaxing things. Like, you know, you don't have to worry about too much when you go to work with people, because for the most part, they're just normal people. You know, they have a mental illness, they have symptoms and issues, but you can have conversations with them and you can relate with them pretty well, I think. At least it wasn't too hard for me. That was my experience. And that was with severe people in the middle of crises as well. So if you don't work with that, then that would just be that much easier.
But it's probably a good idea to have that experience so that you know the difference between somebody who's depressed and somebody who's really depressed. People that can't get out of bed in the morning, or they just, constant thoughts of suicide, or not constant, but that's what we think of. But that your job is to see, okay, is this thought of suicide imminent? Are they going to do it or not? Do they have the ability to rationalize and deal with it, even though because they may have those thoughts all the time. I mean, off and on. That just may be their kind of their norm.
Right.
But having, like, I worked at the foster care at a level 6 behavioral disordered school, where you had, and you saw everything there. And I worked in the classroom. But they had upstairs, they had basically they lived, some of them, the level 6 guys lived upstairs. And it was an eye-opening, you just don't realize. And then I worked contract for foster care in Kansas, and you see things you didn't even know existed on the planet, how people live. So.
I was going to say, I went to a conference because in the state hospital, a really big one is suicide risk, as you mentioned that. And there was a good conference that really kind of covered that subject really well, because that's one of the big issues, is the issue of whether you can predict suicide risk and how much you're kind of responsible for. Because if somebody does kill themselves after they, 3 days after they meet with you, are you responsible? Should you have caught that? Should you have known what was going to happen? And that it was a really good conference because it really kind of soothed that fear and gave you the tools to know, like, okay, here's what you should be looking for, here's the areas you need to be paying attention to. And if I can find that stuff, I'll email it over to you, because
That'd be
it was
great.
pretty useful. I don't know, does anybody have any questions right now? Because I do have different things I can bring up real fast.
What's the course look like in graduate school?
What's the course look like?
What's the course look like? How much homework you have and things like that?
Okay. Well, based on my experience, I guess what I'll say is, I guess I'll ask you a real quick question, because I remember in undergrad you had maybe, I'll just make this up, like 3 or 4 or 5 tests in a class and 5 papers. Is that kind of an average? Okay. From my experience, it definitely depended on the professor, but they seem to be kind of one or the other. Like, I had a professor who only gave 3 exams, and that was literally it in his class. And so what that meant is that it was less work, obviously, but then a lot higher pressure, because if you botched one of those tests, you just killed your grade. But I'll also say that the tests weren't excruciatingly horrible. They weren't 500 question tests. They weren't over the most nuanced, picky details that nobody could ever hope to remember or get right. And that kind of goes with papers as well. They weren't, I didn't have to write 50-page essays. I didn't have to research 100 articles and reference all this material. It was very reasonable. So, for example, the papers you turn in here, average, I'll just ask you actually, how long do you typically make what they have to turn in?
Oh, if it's a paper at the end, probably no more than 10 pages, 5 to 10.
Oh.
I mean, they get all anxious and grumpy if I go over that. So I don't, and I do too, because at grading it becomes an issue,
Mhm.
So we do more reflections and.
The short term.
Yeah. More thinking about your thinking,
Okay.
you know, epistemic or whatever that.
Yeah.
So you have, what kind of papers do you have? You were about to say.
I would say roughly maybe on the other kind of classes, it would depend on, there'd be either like 2 or 3 papers at most, and they'd be maybe 15 pages. But usually, like the class I'm thinking of, it was kind of a, you would turn in a couple assignments, but it's all building towards one big project. So you get scored on smaller bits of the papers, and they may be 7 pages each, but it add up to maybe 25. But they don't like busy work, because as you're getting at, it's a time killer for them. And I think that's also why they schedule classes the way they do, so that they only have to work a couple of days for their classes, and if they don't have to give out a bunch of paperwork and assignments for them to grade, that's good for them.
Because sometimes at the graduate level, that's what we're looking at here, is trying to build more graduate programs. The professors have to publish in order to work. So they have to, in their free time, they're writing books or writing papers, journal articles, because that's what the university wants. That's where you get the notoriety to the university. Some schools are more big on that. We're not going to be that. I don't think it's going to be that hot and heavy here, but they still encourage it.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to have time to do. You have to have time to do that, obviously. And I think for the most part, most professors, I struggle with this. How do you get people to learn what they need to learn, and what is it that they don't really need? Like you can look it up on in the library in your hand, on the cell phone, but what do you need to know so you can function in the world, like in the world of an inpatient psychiatric unit? To me, if you can function in there and do your job, then you've got the skills. Then you can pretty much look up any information you need to know. You can educate yourself, essentially, because you know what you need to know in that situation. But there's so many different environments. Like you said, you could go crazy trying to memorize everything. It's not going to work. And then they change the laws or the rules, and you'd have to redo it different.
Yeah, DSM-5.
Yeah, they change all the guidelines. So not all of them, but just enough to mess you up.
Right, because they made a lot of changes in the DSM-5.
And see, I haven't even gotten into that. It's not being actively in practice. I just have avoided it. Other questions that you guys have?
I'll mention, just as a quick note, do you do MLA style for the most part?
APA.
Oh, you did change the APA, okay.
Everything's APA pretty much and for sure, and for us now, English department would be the MLA.
Okay. I thought I remember we just did MLA.
I think back then it was left up, but having been working on a PhD and finding out that everything's APA
Yeah.
in psychology.
Yeah, I was going to mention that because I remember in undergrad we did MLA, and it's not a huge difference.
So I've beaten them up last semester in history of psychology with it, because we haven't really been covering it. They don't make them do that in a journal entry, but
Right.
When you go to grad school, you're going to have to do it. You have to know it. That's why I told you guys, buy one of the books instead of just, you can look at it online too, but it's handy to have a book it depends on how you do that. And then every university has a little, like at a graduate school, at my school, they do some of it different than APA, like this silly little things like, how you set up the reference page. Well, they want it different on the dissertation program, so.
Yeah, well, the thesis and all that's a whole different animal.
Right. So do you have a thesis at your school? Okay. I didn't have one at social work school either, the one I went to. You tell them what a thesis is, though.
Essentially, it's a giant research paper. I heard some whisperings back there. Do you know thesis or?
Yeah, like you just have to do research. Because I transferred to another school and then transferred back.
Mhm.
But there was graduate students giving presentations over their thesis that they wrote.
Mhm. Yeah, I think just as a quick average, I would think it's 100 pages. And I had a roommate who was in the history program, and he had a choice, either do a test or write a thesis, and he went for the thesis route. And yeah, it's definitely, as you can imagine, 100 pages, it's a big time crunch. You gotta do a lot of research, and I think as far as the psychology, I think in general, the concept is that you have to add something to your field. I think that's part of the way it's
Kind of like a
interpreted.
PhD, it's a mini dissertation.
Yeah, and so you have to find something that's a little unique, and at least for psychology, you had to do your own research. You know, so you had to come up with a basic experiment and either do qualitative or quantitative research. But for my program, that wasn't a requirement, and my advisor, you'd have to know him, he's pretty direct and pretty blunt, and I like him for that. But he basically said that it was a waste of time and I didn't need to do it, because if I were ever to go to a PhD or a PsyD program, I'd just have to do
Do it
another one
again.
anyways. It wouldn't do me any good, and you know, for all that time crunch, it just wasn't going to be worth it. Because the alternative for me was just taking 6 hours of 2 other courses, basically. So for me, it was kind of a no-brainer.
So you mentioned Psych B or going on getting a PhD. What is your goal? Where do you go?
Short term?
Yeah, well, short term and long term. If you have a long term goal, I don't know.
Well, this is my little pipe dream right now, is find a job for the time being, kind of get sort of an apartment or a house, and just kind of get established for a few years, start paying back my school loans, my expensive private school, school loans. And from that point on, I don't know years, how long that'll take, but then eventually kind of look for getting into a doctorate program, and I'd really like to be a professor at some point, because I love the idea of having 3 months vacation during the summer,
Yeah.
which I'm sure you're busy and you have different
Yeah.
responsibilities, but for the most part, it still sounds like a pretty nice.
It's more
Yeah.
flexibility.
Mhm. And you can always teach summer courses too, or.
Or I go do a workshop, do
Mhm.
contract work during the summer because I have the freedom to do that. So I go do intensive outpatient, basically, stuff, groups.
Okay.
And so it's a
Yeah.
lot. It's a lot of fun in the sense of it's the kind of work that I find. If any work is fun, it's fun. Work is still hard, and you still have to do all the anxiety that goes with it and all that stuff. Getting ready to walk in and sit down with people you never met before, and all that stuff.
Like this?
Yeah, like you just did. Well, you knew one person. You knew I was here to back you up.
That's
I got your
true.
back.
I didn't know you'd film me though.
I know I didn't say that because then, but then I thought I didn't think we'd even have this many folks show up. So there's still, I can't
A
count,
third.
6. There's still 3 left and missing. So that'll be good. See, and that instead of taking roll, or I still do roll just to keep track of it, but rather than penalize people for not being here because of sports and all that, I'll film it so that they can watch it and I have a Facebook page. I'll YouTube it and put it on Facebook. Then they can watch this class and actually do an outline of it. So they actually get the information that way and they don't miss it. So I don't like to penalize, just, even if you're excused, it really messes up your ability to plan things, around your sports or anybody being gone. What other questions do you have? This is the time for you guys to ask any questions you have, even if it's not about graduate school, just getting out of school. Amber, you look like you were going to ask him something a little bit.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out something in my head.
Okay. Well, I'll ask you one. What did you do did you do anything besides the internship? Was it called an internship or a practicum?
It's kind of goofy, but my school called it an internship, and my internship site called it a practicum.
Oh, okay. So that was at the state hospital.
Yeah.
And how long was it?
For me, it was from July through January. And I guess I should.
So a summer and a semester.
Yeah, what I would really say is that it's 750 hours. I'm from Kansas again, so I don't know how much different kind of Do you have master's level licensure for psychology?
I don't honestly know that. I think they do the professional counselor in marriage and family. I don't know that there's a, is it licensure or is it register? It used to be
It's-
registered.
In Kansas, it's licensed master's level psychologist.
Oh, okay, they used to have R, registered license, or master's level psychologist. My friend was one.
Okay.
So they must have grown, must have beat back the PhDs enough to get that put in.
Yeah, which may or may not be a benefit. I'll find that out eventually. But basically, what I'm getting at is that whatever master's school you go to will have an internship, and the requirements will be based on if there's licensure at your level or however that kind of works for what you need to practice at master's level. But for me, it was 750 hours of an internship and 350 hours of 350 of those hours which had to be client contact. And so that's why it took so long, because I had like either 11 or 1,200 hours when I finished. But because of all the paperwork and at a state hospital, there were issues, there were staff changes, and there were kind of times where it's difficult to get people where you needed them. And so it just took longer. And that wasn't a bad thing though, because it gave me more time to be there and learn a little bit more.
And are you done then? What is your, you're are you licensed?
Mhm.
Okay, what do you have to do to get the license?
Well, I'll explain real fast. It's the reason I'm able to come here is I'm done with all my coursework. And so it's just technicality where I have to wait till May to get my degree. But at this point, what I have to do is apply to the Kansas BSRB, which I don't remember what it stands for.
Behavioral Science Regulatory Board. Unfortunately, I know exactly what it, I have to, social workers are under it too. Everybody in Kansas is licensed as far as that goes, behavioral sciences.
But yeah, I have to take the EPPP, which again, I don't know what that stands for. But it's like a 4-hour psychology exam,